Greetings once again, my friends, and welcome back to Drak Reviews as we take on the first review of 2018. Now that 2017 is behind us, it's time for us to take on the brand spanking new games of the year. And originally, I had different plans entirely for the first review of 2018, but then I got a unique offer. An indie game developer by the name of Captain D reached out to me and asked me to review, and even gave me a review copy for his upcoming game, Captain Disaster in Death Has a Million Stomping Boots. And after talking with him and telling him that, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not necessarily going to hold back or anything like that, he agreed. And so here we are, and let's go ahead and get started in this review of Captain Disaster in Death Has a Million Stomping Boots. Starting with the story, this is kind of an origin. At least from what I could tell, there wasn't a prequel game to this. This is the origins of Captain Disaster. So you find yourself with said captain as he is broke and lazy and needing money. And it just so happens that his ship's computer has found an assignment that would get them some money to at least be a little bit more lazy. A delivery job nonetheless. So at that point, Captain Disaster decides to take it on. I'm calling him that because he doesn't really have a name aside from that. And in fact, the name christens him, or the game christens him this throughout the story. You go and pick up the package that you need to pick up, you deliver it, and that's how you come across an evil, sinister plot by the Proboscins, or at least one rogue Proboscin, to unleash, a million stomping boots on the galaxy. I'm not necessarily going to spoil what that is, but, well, a million stomping boots, that's a lot of stomping boots. So with that being said, did I have any complaints with the story? Not really. The story I actually felt was really well put together, considering that this is kind of in the Space Quest vein. That's the best way that I know how to describe it. It's got a lot of references, especially towards sci-fi, but I did notice a couple of other references to, say, Monty Python's Flying Circus. I think there was even a fantasy movie or two in there. There's plenty there to be able to get people into the story and laughing their butts off at the various references that happen. So I will admit, I didn't really take too many points off for the story. I think it's exactly what an adventure game plot needs to be. Moving on into the visuals, this is where I'm a little bit more divided. I know where I stand on it, but I can understand where people might have an issue. Visually, I didn't really have a problem with this game. It's very much developed like in the original VGA kind of format. I would actually say it's earlier than that, and I'm not, I think it's EGA. It's developed in that kind of an art style just to be kind of more fitting into the classic adventure game feel. And for me, who's played classic adventure games, that doesn't necessarily seem to be a problem. I do understand where a lot more modern adventure gamers who have been brought in, say, from the Telltale games or from the remasterings of games like Monkey Island, Full Throttle, King's Quest, amongst others, they are used to a little bit more of a polish. I can see them having a little bit of an issue, but frankly, the retro tuning to this works towards the story that it's trying to tell. So for me, it works, but I can see where some people would have issues with the visuals and might get turned off because it looks so, well, old. I honestly think, though, if you can look past that, you actually see a much better game than you think you are going to. Moving on into the gameplay. I gotta say, I didn't really take too many points off of this one. Personally, it is an adventure game. You point, you click, you talk, you combine items, you solve puzzles. And that's the way it goes, and that's the way that this game plays out. There are a couple of moments where I feel either dialogue can be a little delayed, or in some cases, and I have a feeling this is going to be a big complaint with, like I said, more casual adventure gamers, some of the puzzles are amazingly hard. For me, not so much. I'm used to complex puzzles because of LucasArts and Sierra, but for somebody who's just basically come in via Telltale, where the puzzles aren't necessarily the hardest, I could see where that would actually be a little bit of a problem. And also, I will admit, I did kind of nitpick a little bit here with points because if it's a problem for them, that's really the audience you need to bring in. The nostalgic adventure gamers are probably already going to be there for you, but like with any game, a new audience needs to be brought in, and so a lot of the more complicated puzzles, I think, would be an issue for others. The only solution, though, that I can think of to fix that is roughly kind of what LucasArts did. Make a basic mode and then make a Mega Monkey mode, a hard mode. And then at that point, you can put in the really hard puzzles, but in the easy mode, you can kind of work that around. That's up to the developers, and that's just only my theory on how you could fix that problem, but I can see where that's a little bit of a problem, and I did take a little bit of points off in the gameplay department because of that. Moving on into the audio. The audio here is actually not that bad, considering that it is indie, and the fact that I had a feeling, just because of the casting, or at least the credits, that a lot of the developers were actually brought in to voice some of these roles, and they actually did really good considering. Captain Disaster is probably my favorite role amongst them, and there are a couple of roles from random people, either on the planet Proboscis or on the other planet, which is escaping me at the moment, that do feel a little out of place, but I don't necessarily think that they hurt the plot enough to justify complaining about it. You'll have those problems even in Sierra games, even in LucasArts games, where one voice just doesn't fit out amongst the rest, and that doesn't necessarily derail you, because you're not going to be dealing with this person in the next act or in the next scene or anything like that. As soon as if he has a puzzle, you do the puzzle and you're done with him. So at that point, I think it is at least worth bringing up that the rest of the voiceover is great, and the way that it should be for a game like this. The only complaint that I would probably have in the audio department is, I know that some people through their reviews are saying that they love the music. For me, the music was kind of generic. It wasn't necessarily memorable. I'm not saying it's bad, but it was kind of generic for me. It didn't necessarily stick out like, say, the Space Quest theme or the King's Quest theme. It was very much basic electronic stuff that I've heard before, and that was discouraging. Not necessarily a deal breaker, but discouraging. So I will admit, in my purview, I did take off a little bit of points in regards to that. Also, another thing that I want to bring into the audio is there were a couple of sounds that I believe were put in too loud on the audio. So for example, when you get to the first planet, your translator's broken. So in some cases you have to talk to some aliens and you can't necessarily hear them speaking your language. They're speaking some random sounds, and those sounds on headphones and even on speakers got really loud sometimes, very booming. And I know that it was booming enough that it kind of scared my little toddler, and it was also a little bit harder to deal with on my end. So I would also say, as an advice, and I will admit I took a little bit of points there too, just turn it down a little bit on those sound effects and you're fine. Moving on into replayability and presentation. Replay value here is tough because, like with most adventure games, unless you're King's Quest or Space Quest and there's a point total, replayability is there so that you can go back and figure out what you did wrong to be able to get more points. Or if you want to be able to get the super secret ending in like a LucasArts game, you can go back and do that. But most of the time in an adventure game, there really isn't too much replayability, especially in the older games. You play through the story and that's about it. For this one in particular, that's kind of my beef on it too, is that I can see this being good for like a 1 or a 2 time playthrough, and maybe 6 months or a year down the road, you play it again for nostalgia, but I can't necessarily see people playing it again and again and again. And frankly, I don't think it's meant to be done that way. So at that point, especially considering that I know the developer is looking to get a sequel out there as soon as possible. So I'm not necessarily taking points out for it, but I can't necessarily acknowledge that there's replay value here. So a little bit is taken off there. Presentation, does it all come together? Despite its flaws, yes, it does. Considering that this is done from a very small team and one that's aspiring to be able to do more games in the series, kind of like how Space Quest had a legacy there and to be able to do more references, I think this actually works really, really well, especially as a solid first attempt. Remember, as I've said before in numerous other reviews, first attempts are going to be a little bit more rough cut. First attempts are going to have a little bit more jagged edges. So at that point, the only encouragement that I would give to the developer is, now that you've put out your rough cut, now you need to actually look at the overall design and start smoothing out the edges and being able to put out something a little bit more polished. And this is why I have no problem giving Captain Disaster and Death Has a Million Stomping Boots a 9 out of 10. It is a solid A effort for a first entry in a series, and I have already been told by the developer they have been okayed for a sequel, so I'm looking forward to see if they can actually start smoothing out the edges in the sequel. I'm unfortunately not remembering the title of it, but I'm hoping that they are able to polish things out and be able to make a much more honed product in the meantime as they develop it. But is it worth it? Currently, the only way that I know you're able to get Captain Disaster is on Game Jolt, and it is for $8.99 US. Is that necessarily a bad price for it? I would actually say no, it's not. Considering what you're getting, $8.99 is not necessarily a bad thing, However, I would encourage the developer, and I've seen that they've kind of done this here and there. I would encourage them to do a little bit more. Get sales going on for this. I know that you're handing out review copies for people, and that's great. But if you can actually get it so that maybe a couple of dedicated Game Jolt fans can get it for $6.99 on a special deal, that would be awesome. I think that would be able to get it in so many more hands and be able to help out with that. The other thing that I'm not necessarily faulting it for, but I want to mention is this is a game that feels like it should be on Steam. I know that some people might disagree with me on this, but I can tell that the developer gave their 100%, wanted to be able to do a funny game. And I feel like this is one of those examples of a good indie developer wanting to get onto that marketplace. And I would also urge the developer, Captain D, to be able to get it onto Steam. If you're having problems with that, then I understand. But this is one of those things where I honestly believe this would do really, really well on the Steam marketplace, especially if you added in just, tiny achievements here and there. I think that would help it out even more. But yeah, for the price right now, it's not that bad. Considering for first entry adventure games, you're getting them around the $5 area anyway. And considering this is a brand new entry, a brand new series, a brand new adventure game, yeah, the extra couple of bucks is actually worth it considering what you get for it. And that's going to go ahead and do it for this review. So thank you guys so much for your love, for your patience, for your support. And thank you so much to Captain D for giving me the review code. I enjoyed it so much that I actually am going to be purchasing it to be able to help support you. And of course, I'll be back in time for the next review.